yesterday. It kind of talks about, yesterday's talk was more about don't believe everything you see, don't believe everything you hear about cannabis and what goes on in other countries. Briefly, we look at the US and Canada and Israel and we think it's all rosy, but the underlying issues around medical cannabis are still there, like there is no prescription going on in the US or Canada or even Israel. There is no products. That's why we're in the situation we are now. There is nothing to prescribe. When our politicians say you can now go to a doctor and get a prescription, it's not really like that. It's more like you go to a doctor that they've approved and they'll do some recommendations that go to the TGA or another ad hocly devised government department they have now, which will approve this doctor approving this patient or this recommendation this patient can use generally an imported product. It's never been clinically trialled. It's unlicensed and not registered. That's what the classification of these imported medical cannabis products are. So, that yesterday's talk was much about that, and similarly in the US, where primarily it's medical cannabis is people smoking high THC cannabis, and in fact when they say medical, it's generally regarded as being a bit more stronger than the general recreational one. Which leads me to, people believing what they see and hear, and with medical cannabis, it's really distressing to see some of the things that are being written about medical cannabis on Google. And people can Google anything, your condition, medical cannabis, and come up a page, and some of them look really professional. In relation to cancer, they'll refer to 146 research programs. Studies that say cannabis helps patients and cancer. Look, when you look into these papers, they're generally talking about individual cannabinoids, just delta-9 and in vitro, which means in a petri dish or in a test tube, that kind of thing. And when I did initially start asking doctors and researchers about this, they said, well, look, bleach will kill cancer in a test tube. And when I first got into this back in 1999, it was all about celery seed extract. And celery seed extract will kill cancer in a test tube. And, I started seeing the medical cannabis things happening, and I actually wrote a book a while ago. I have grown high THC cannabis under a permit back in 2001-2 with Andrew Kavasalis. It was a very rare opportunity, but we did the follow-up study at the Southern Cross Uni. So when I asked the uni about what sparked it was, now you can have a $2 million gas chromatography your mass spectrometry and side seam detection and all this stuff to test your cannabis, but unless the machinery knows what it's looking for, it's useless putting samples through. I didn't know about this. So what you have to do is you have to get pure delta-9, pure delta-8, pure CBD in its various forms. And these are available on the international market. We had to get them from Sigma over in Israel. And they're called standards. And they come over and you run these samples through your analytical devices, and it knows what it's looking for. But also, these individual cannabinoids are available to pain researchers, to cancer researchers, all over the world, mostly students. So when I wrote my book, I did the Sydney book launch was at the Institute of Pain Management Research at the North Shore Hospital. I was mentored by a Professor Lawrence Mather, you still see his name come up here and there on medical cannabis research and stuff. But he took me several times. He took me for a tour through his lab, and they talked about how they can get pure delta-9 and they can slice a brain and hook it up to electrodes and put a bit of this in and put a bit of that. And it kind of got me thinking about, how does this translate to end products, and especially if you've already got all these other research. But then when you look into other products, and it's almost a weekly thing, if you have a look at your TV or your news or current affair, there'll always be somebody who's got a new thing. They've just come out of the jungle, or they've just isolated something new out of a fish or a shellfish or something, and they'll always show it's a sequence of shots with the professor with a pipette, the test tubes, the researcher talking about how great it is, and it finishes off with generally a health minister talk where the journal will say how long before this product will make it to the market. And they always finish off with telling about it could take 5 to 10 years and you know, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the same with cannabis. You know, the transfer or the assumption that in vitro research will translate to high, you know, oral doses is a far stretch. It really is a far stretch. And so, you know, there's been researchers around the world. You know, some of the biggest, you know, I suppose the most prominent is Rick Simpson. You know, Rick Simpson said, an American guy. I've read the full story and I'm quite happy to discuss it. But he diagnosed himself with cancer. He got himself some hash oil that he made and he put it on, and sure enough, his skin cancers went away. And he told his initial stories talk about how he learned this by Spanish researchers, the Guzman Research Group in Spain. But yeah, these guys, they heard, you know, Rick Simpson said that the Spanish found a cure for cancer using cannabis, and I did it and it worked, and so forth. And the Spanish researchers, they, in an extraordinary move, they did their own YouTube to tell people, hey, we didn't find a cure for cancer. This is what we did. We got pure Delta-9 and we injected it directly into the tumours of rats in their brain. They all died, but we did see something happen. We did a human study with 10 terminal patients, and we injected the same thing. They all died as well, but we saw something. It's too far of a stretch, but they finish off by talking about, and they've got several YouTubes out there, but you know what they did find is that the research they're doing now is that oral dose cannabinoids with chemo drugs do a magnificent job. Cannabinoids protect healthy cells, and the chemo drugs do their work on the mutated cells, and there's kind of you know, but these things are a long way off. But you know, that's just some of the prime examples of where you really look into it. I've read lots of testimonials of people who have used cannabis with their cancer or whatever. And nowadays, I want to know, I want to see the diagnosis. I want to know that they actually did have that, it was diagnosed properly. But what you do see on these genuine cases where they were diagnosed, invariably they did have chemo, they had surgery, but cannabis helped them. That was ultimately what went down. We see a few miracles. There's no doubt about that. We do see a few miracles, but those miracles coincide with people changing their diet, changing their lifestyle, changing a lot of things about their life, and using cannabinoids. And, you know, to date, I still can't think of any particular condition that cannabis cures. It doesn't cure epilepsy, but it will stop seizures. It doesn't cure Parkinson's or other conditions like that, but it does address symptoms. It does slow the condition down. See, that's what we know. The science tells us that as well. But you know, you know, when you're looking at real science now, based on medical cannabis, people using raw product or a raw oil of all the different cannabinoids put together, you really have to look at Israel nowadays, where again, you know, people it's not believing what you see. So everyone assumes medical cannabis is off and running in Israel. It's actually not. There's no products being developed over there. 30 odd years of research, most of it's been done in private palliative care units on private kibbutzes, so really far removed. I mean, if you're a patient, we've had Israeli doctors come to the talks, big conferences in Sydney, put up their PowerPoint with step-by-step instructions on how a patient gets cannabis in Israel. So first of all, the patient has to find one of less than 3% of doctors who will even help. If that doctor will do a recommendation to a committee that the health department runs. The health committee, this committee never meets the patients, but they decide whether they're going to get to use cannabis or not. if they say yes, they'll inform the patient, and then the patient can then go to one of the 6 legal growers in Israel. Nowadays, they've got to be clinical, these growing facilities now, but basically then the patient explains their medical condition to the grower, and the grower decides what they're going to use, how they're going to use it, how often, and so, because the doctors don't know. It's that obvious stuff, you know, it's like obvious, you know, the obvious one that should be in everyone's eyes. Governments don't own cannabis. Governments don't own any drugs, in fact. Our United Nations drug treaties ensure that. But yeah, so if you understand that governments don't own cannabis, you have to accept that companies do. And whenever a government's here in Australia, especially when they're talking about medical cannabis and changing laws and doing this, they're owned. At the very most, they can change laws that would let companies come in and develop drugs. And again, that's with the assumption that the rest of the world has left the door open for Australian companies to stroll up and start making medical cannabis prescription drugs and whatever they're talking about. So, you know, what you're seeing and what we're hearing, well, you shouldn't just believe everything. You should look a bit further into it. You know, at the state level, when you've got, you know, state, you know, whether it's Greens or opposition, Labor, Liberal, this is a federal and an international issue. This is not a state. There is no state government in Australia that can do it. And in fact, I defy any of them to just tell me a state anywhere in the world, any government in the world that has willingly introduced a meaningful medical cannabis regime. The other point I should make about Israel is all their research on it all this time has been direct. They have to explain it to the DEA in the USA. And if you look, there's a guy, Raphael Moshelin, he's the godfather of cannabis. He's the first one to discover Delta-9, and he's always talked about, but if you listen to an unedited interview that he gives, he does always say that it's all under the direction of the DEA. My company, I'm actually, just to make a declaration, I am involved in an Australian medical cannabis company, an ASX listed company. We are doing a $3.5 million research project in Israel, and that had to be reported to the DEA. We're not allowed to make a product, we're only allowed to do the research on it. And because that's how it is. Ultimately, it comes down to a lawful source. Every government can, you know, in theory, allow medical cannabis use, but the proper way it's done is like opium and coca. It has to be from a lawful source. There is companies that own those lawful sources. America's related to basically all of them, and Europe as well, but they're very big companies. So, I mean, you know, as much as we're fighting for medical cannabis, and no matter how logical and rational it does seem that we should be doing it, the fact is no government has really done it. And so the extension of that and what I'm talking about is no state government can do it. I would prefer someone like the Greens just came clean with the public and said, you know what, we can't do this, but we definitely know that no state government, Labor or Liberal, going into the election, they can't do it either. They would have done it by now, whether it was a Liberal government in New South Wales or a Labor government down in Victoria. They haven't been able to do it. So it really is a federal thing. I mean, I'll be more happy about the debate when it matures and we're talking about, you know, the states have got together and formed a COAG of just the health ministers from all the states, and all they do is talk about what they're doing with the Prime Minister and the Federal Health Minister. How are we going to get this going? You know, that's all we need to hear, not states talking about, yeah, we're going to do it, we'll do it. You know, Bob Carr, if anybody has a memory, Bob Carr talked medical cannabis a long time ago. You had 4 members of the New South Wales Cabinet whose family were using cannabis for medical purposes. They really wanted to get it going. The dark forces cut them off. Not my words, their words. You try and address that with the media, it's really not a thing. I mean, you know, there's inbuilt flaws even in what we're doing now. I think, you know, even with Australian companies and on the ASX and everything, I pose the question that if you think it's a good idea to invest, you know, millions of dollars to make a facility to make medical cannabis, and you finally can make a product that you can find authorised doctors to prescribe it to a patient or to recommend it, and that patient goes out and loses their licence, how good is your product going to be? How big is your market going to be if people are losing their licences because of saliva testing? there's no exemption built in, and even people who are using cannabis in a semi or legal way now, they sign away their right. They make an undertaking that, if they get caught, it can't be used as a defence. We've got police being thrown into the middle of this now to use discretion. That's a whole other situation. Discretion by police, where it involves laws that the public don't support, that their own family are breaking, that relies on a black market, and all of this just leads to corruption. And we shouldn't not talk about that. Cannabis is, in Australia, we Australians spend about over $5 billion a year on cannabis. Australians use over half a tonne of cannabis a day. It's twice the size of the wine industry. And you can't tell me there's no corruption in it. Just have a look at alcohol prohibition. But yeah, the corruption, the white-collar corruption that's going on around drugs in general, it's right in front of our faces, but nobody wants to talk about it. It's a big thing. Last week, the Victorian police got found out that they actually systematically, actively fudged their books right through, from the cop on the street right through to senior police. Over 250,000 extra saliva tests, breath tests were said to be done when they weren't. Again, I'm with the hemp embassy as well, so we've kept an eye on these situations for a very, very long time. We're the only country doing saliva testing. The rest of the world read the reports on these devices. They're unreliable, can't be recommended, but we still did it. Somebody's making money. But some of the warnings that were given out was that it would alter drug use trends. If a country was to do it, they really had to consider the pros and the cons. I'm quoting from these international reports, and it did say that, there's a fear you're going to interfere with your drug use trends. People will go away from cannabis and use other drugs that aren't being tested for, or that move through the body a lot quicker. And also that police would pull back on the use of alcohol testing, because now they've got to do these other tests. And obviously that was happening, and Victorian police found a way through corruption, because when you're doing this stuff, it is a corruption of the process, to falsify, how many alcohol tests they were doing per year. So, when you talk about, police being naughty and doing things like that, yeah, there is an interest by police to keep, maximum amount of drug support officers going, with the best stats and, things like that. That's what they do. Cannabis is just such an easy bust for police. It's so easy, And, you're looking at a drug that, more Australians enjoy using cannabis than any other illicit drug. And that's just the fact. And we've got to work around, how we move the debate forward in whether it's recreational or industrial or medical use. We've got to, there's a particular way that some of the language that's going to be used that would give me a lot of, I'd feel a lot better at knowing that the debate's moving forward. When we're talking about the UN, we're talking about, for instance, Canada more recently has regulated recreational use or adult use. That government, they seriously wanted to do it. That was part of an election promise by Justin Trudeau. And so when they did win, they started talking about the initial report. We didn't understand the United Nations regulations and stuff like that. Anyway, in the end, they did it. The government devised a policy and they tabled it at the United Nations. That's what you have to do. In fact, another group of the United Nations is called the INCB, the International Narcotic Control Board. That's a body that looks after all the drugs, cocaine, opium, other drugs, cannabis. That's the reporting body. It was very interesting the way that the Canadians tabled their document as well. It was at a UN convention. It was at a UN seminar called A Drug-Free World. We Can Do It. And at that event, there was all sorts of world leaders. It was pretty, I can't even explain the complexities of what went down. It was UNGASS, UNGAS. That was, if anyone cares to look it up or anything. People went from all over the world to go to this conference because they felt that this was the conference that there would be new ideas put forward about the drug law. And that's all the drug law reformists wanted to see, just a change of ideas. Anyway, that happened. The Canadians tabled their document. I think a couple of other countries got up and started talking about, relaxing the drug laws. It started off by a couple of weeks before there was a outcomes paper put out. And I kind of read this outcomes paper and didn't put two and two together. Then it turns out the opening address of this meeting was, well, everyone's seen the outcomes document, there was an uproar and everything, and from the chair came a response that, oh no, we came up, we had our meetings, we've done our outcomes, and this seminar is just for people to discuss how we're going to implement the changes that we've provided here. So it was a real bummer. As I said, the Canadians tabled their document, other countries got up, but it finished off with some Southeast Asian countries and Egypt as well, really going hard. All you Western countries that are relaxing your cannabis laws, blah, blah, blah. But it finished out with a representative from the Philippines. This is just before Duterte got in power. But they said, the conference is a drug-free world, we're going to show you how to do it. And then we ended up with all those judicial killings over in the Philippines and that. So, there's people doing it really tough, around the world. We're in the same boat as most people around the world. We really are. By and large, most people around the world don't have access to medical cannabis. Most people, 85% of the world, don't have access to opiates, medical opiates for pain relief. That's the fact. The INCB, who controls all this, has done two different reports, one about 20 years ago and one more recently, criticising themselves and the member nations that have not addressed this problem, that 15% of the world's population is using most of the pain drugs, and that 85% of the world don't even have. And now us Westerners, America and Canada, we all want medical cannabis as well. There's some real disparities, So, when you put all things in perspective, this is an international issue that has to be handled at a federal level. And when we start seeing that kind of thing happening, I think that's when we all can be rest assured that yes, the debate is moving forward. And on the other, in the meantime, don't believe everything you see and read about medical cannabis. I'm sure your parents would have told you that kind of stuff as you were growing up, yeah. But I meet some cannabis activists who just do not doubt one word that's written about cannabis. And yet they will talk about all the lies and stuff that's propagated by people on Facebook and social media and on the web and that. But when it comes to cannabis, they will not doubt one word. And I don't think that's a safe place to be in. So that's going to be my final word without bringing everyone too far down. Just thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. And we have a question in the back. Hello. Yeah.
So what do you think of it's really actually likely that they are going to have legal recreation of cannabis?
All right.
And if the answer is yes, will Australia just follow suit and do that change because we have to?
So just for the recording, that's a question about New Zealand's 2020 referendum.
Yep. So again, New Zealand, what happened there was to form that, they're a minority government over there, they formed a coalition government with the Greens. And it's always been a Greens thing. Last time they did this, they even had a Rastafarian Green, Nandor Tasco. But part of that agreement to form that coalition was that they wouldn't talk about cannabis. Different story this time. Like I said, they're talking about the whole government wanting to do it, at the federal government. Now, we're a long, long way away from that here in Australia. And this is on recreational. They still haven't addressed medical, you have to understand. But a referendum like that would give the New Zealand government something to take to the UN. We've got to do it, blah, blah. Now, we've had a referendum. Like in the US, in those states, what happened there, they were in the United States, again, just get your head around it. The United States, they formed that union, and part of that constitution that brought them all together, there's some loopholes in there. And one of them is citizens-initiated referendum, where citizens of a state can initiate a referendum. So, although we don't have that in our constitution, nor does... So anyway, in the US, Those constitutional measures were used, they had their referendum. What's important to know that all those state governments from California right through to Colorado ran the no campaign. This was a vote, a referendum. So in New Zealand, and you will see opposition, you will see people running the no vote on that, and you will see people running the yes. But what will come out with is probably a yes vote that at least New Zealand can take to the United Nations and say we need to change it, or to the INCB. We've got this. It's similar to what's going on in the US. Nothing's going to leave our border. Just like in those states individually, you can't cross the border even if the next state has got medical care. Huh?
FDA.
Oh yeah. Well, the feds, in theory, the federal government can go into California, go to a medical cannabis shop and bust all those people, take them to a federal court and they go to federal jail. That can still happen. So that won't happen in New Zealand. But, when we're talking about the similarities, Australia under the UN drug treaties, like I was saying, it's legal to grow medical cannabis, or they say it's legal to do medical cannabis, opium and coca. We're one of the few countries that are making money on that document. We allow 2 foreign companies to grow half the world's opium in Australia. So we make about 300 mil, and it's one of the points that comes up every now and again when we're talking about medical cannabis at the federal level. So, I wish all the best to New Zealand and go that far. But really, what I'm looking forward to seeing is the kind of machinations, whether Australia's going to step in and say no, whether the UN is going to be saying no. And then, we've got these UN drug conventions. All right, so what does happen to a country? We should be looking at Canada. If there is no international consequences, well, why shouldn't Australia break those rules and not do recreational, but at least start on a medical cannabis regime? I mean, if really nothing happens, but think about what can happen. For me, again, don't believe even everything I say. But for me, what I think is that, these pharmaceutical companies are very rich. If you have a look at the kind of prices they charge for some drugs and why they need to be put on PBSs, you've got a $100,000 drug that the government's subsidising 99% of, that kind of thing. This is going on for lots of different drugs. Billions of dollars are going straight to big pharmaceutical companies direct from PBSs. And it's not just in Australia. PBS situation happens all over the world. So this is money going straight to governments, to the pharmaceutical companies who are, the main ones are all in the top 200 entities of the world. We're still talking about consequences, so there's nothing to stop. Even what happens now, one pharmaceutical company can buy another one. The AIDS drug, I don't know if everyone saw that a few years ago. One company bought another company, the AIDS drug was $40 or whatever it was. They increased the price by 2,000%, just like that. And there was an outcry, but no one could do anything about it. So if a company decides to start charging $100,000 for a $10,000 drug, against one company, the prices a pharmaceutical company charges one country to the next varies. It varies. They can charge whatever they like. I think that is one of the threats that's held over Big Pharma. And again, you've got to try and, I don't know exactly how it works, but you try and work out how those pharma, the representatives, the people who are there, the politicians come and go. You've still got this band of public servants, some of them who get paid more than the ministers. And, who puts them there? There's special companies that are around that all they do is make those appointments into those. And they're almost like a bipartisan company. Then you've got your lobby companies who, have a look at them. I mean, I've looked at, there's one particular that I've checked out, Barton Deacon, or Deacon Barton, one of those, owned by Labor people, but run by coalition. It says on their website they specialise in lobbying coalition governments. It's all a stable of ex-coalition people, and then they have a secret stable of ones that, if a company wants to do this or do that, they put in a special, they can hire it, or work with particular ex-politicians who still know the politicians that are in there. But, and then the donations come in, and it's all, a donation can be, that you've just taken, you're hiring 3 or 4, ex-coalition members or nationals or things like that, and it just keeps all of that going. the puppet masters, and you know the pollies come and go. They really, since I've been at this, I'm on our 12th health minister. So you know, and they always have a new. You have a new health minister, and they give you the raid. It's you know, I didn't know, and we'll see what we can do, and find somebody and put their arm around them, you know, another patient, a parent. So yeah, New Zealand. Good luck to them, and you know we should support them. Whether Australia just follows in behind them, I don't know if it'll work like that. But if you know, yeah, I mean it did. Yeah, with hemp seed, we were the last countries. You know, yeah. So let's just see about how that's even going to work. You know, I'm really interested. As I said, you know, I'm really interested to see what kind of machinations come up. Whether Australia does say anything to New Zealand, no, you can't do that, or what. But you know, the more countries that governments that actively try to pursue a better avenue than cannabis prohibition is something we should be, you know, applauding. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
In this multicultural Australia, you mentioned Rastafarian before, and I think that I forgot what I was going to say now, but
I didn't mention Rastafarians.
Yeah, you mentioned some member of New Zealand.
Oh yeah. Nando Tasco. Yeah,
like,
Nando Tasco.
I put Rastafarian down on my census form, which I have.
Yeah.
But then I can, yeah.
Oh, so the Rastafarians, all right, say we look at Jamaica, quite a while ago they did a 3-year Gunga Commission to have a look at a better way of cannabis prohibition. And you've got these Rastas and other people, young folk, that the government criminalising its own people. And they did a 3-year Gunga Commission. They came up with a whole bunch of recommendations, including decriminalising. You can't just decriminalise, you actually got to address supply, regulated supply, that kind of thing. The week before, the Jamaican ambassador was summoned to Washington, and he was told if the Jamaican government votes in favour of these recommendations, that they would lose foreign subsidy, foreign aid from the US. You know, if you want our money, you've got to comply with all the UN drug bins and blah, 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 blah. And yeah, they basically knocked it on the head. But I believe they've had another go now. So yeah, the Rastafarian, freedom of religion and all that, it's all out the window with cannabis, because there's international, it's not like anything else, there's international treaties specifically on cannabis. Yeah. Dolphy baby.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you too.
If us, the people, got organised,
So for Australia, if us the people got organised, is there something we can actually do to pressurise someone to change something?
I mean, organised means coming together and applying pressure. Yes, I mean, you know, the cannabis community is quite varied, and there's different levels of support given. You know, what we do know from the hemp party is that we get our power in the anonymity of a polling booth. You know, when people go into that polling booth, no one's watching, and we get votes from all over the country, from all different, wide range of electorates. We're a solid 1% party. You know, just imagine it, that 1% of the voting population think that cannabis is the number one thing on their list. We are a serious, you know, party. It's a shame that it comes like that. So getting organised, you know yourself, I mean, the cannabis community is quite broad. So you've got people who are growing lots of cannabis and doing all right. You've got the black market, you've got, you know, and who can influence how people think about that. The black market, indoor hydroponic cannabis, is about, you know, 80 to 90% of the Australian clip nowadays. So, you know, it makes it pretty hard. What we find is that it's like gay rights before gay rights came along. You know, you could get a bunch of, you know, gay people wanting to go to a town or something where, while it's still illegal, saying, look, you know, same thing, we know there's lots of gay people here, you shouldn't all just come out because we're here. People are scared of breaking the law openly. You call it a cannabis rally in Melbourne or Sydney or whatever, there's a really good chance there's going to be police. I mean, it's their job, you know, to go to something like that. and maybe get some number plates and follow people and come in and do searches and do things like that. People are scared of having their life interrupted by coming out and going to organised things. As I said, we even the hemp party, we have about 7,000 members, but you know, we get 1% of the voting of the country. We you know, in the NT we've got 5%. I think we've only got 10 members up there, but 5% of the Northern Territory voted hemp. It wasn't a donkey vote; we were second or third down. So it's hard to get people organised. I mean, look what happened in Oxford Street. We should be lucky that we're not being belted by cops who use the law as the excuse. I mean, cannabis users are still being, you know, discriminated against. I mean, we're not being belted, but you know how many home invasions are going on around Australia? People are having their home invaded because someone knows they're growing some cannabis in a room and you can't go to the cops. You get busted. Now we've got loss of licence, that kind of thing. They're really intruding. You know, again, we're not getting bashed, but imagine if there was a test to see if you were gay back in the day. Cops would have used it, you know what, because being gay was against the law. And they would have used a test, but they're using that on us now. And they're using, you know, laboratory confirmation to test, you know, little molecules in your system. We don't even know what they're testing for. You know, is it residual cannabinoids in your mouth, or is it a metabolite that your body's making? You know, there's bullying going on, administrative bullying. There's corruption at every level about this. So, you know, we're doing all right. You know, people are getting more and more organised, but you know, but the more we get, you know, the politician will get, the media. If the media were to catch up with the debate, if the media were to get educated on the subject, we wouldn't still be talking about gateway drugs, the kind of final word that politicians have. A lot of Australians believe medical cannabis is legal. They've read the headline. The rest of the world definitely thinks that medical cannabis is legal in Australia because they've read those headlines coming out of the government. We think it's all just fine and dandy in the US. There's a cannabis arrest every 33 seconds in the US. And we've had Republican candidates come here who stand on a cannabis platform telling us this stuff. Just because cannabis might be legal in one state for medical, and it does free up, you've still got cops who are relying on, you know, making sure that they do keep these phenomenal amounts of cannabis arrests up. They don't want to be seen to be, you know, dropping back just because it's been legal for medical. They can still catch a recreational user. They can still catch a medical cannabis user who hasn't got a valid card from their government. That's the laws, you know. So, yeah, we've got to get more organised, I suppose, coordinated. If we could get the ear of the media, that would definitely give us a lot more access to coordination. And in the meantime, I suppose, yeah, vote hemp. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Really appreciate you all being here and hanging in for the last of it. And we'll let
just a final thing.
this guy do the final question.
Okay, so this gentleman is going to close us down, okay?
Yeah.
I have his question, and you're going to say, so long, farewell.
Yeah.
And the next event is Mardi Gras, eh? 4th of May.
Hemp, hemp, hooray.
A long time ago, about 20 years ago, the ABC had a special about hemp, and our Aussie icon Jack Thompson was the one who was behind all the speech about it and all,
Yep.
and it was very well documentary, and you know, it's the Australian Broadcasting Commission, and they're broadcasting it to us. So what else do we let to believe? We believe that it was good because it did present cannabis as good as very good documentary, and I still stand by it and think it was great.
Yeah, no, there's some really good docos out there, and you know, in all this time, no one's really been able to put a doco saying how bad cannabis is because it just doesn't stand up. Yeah, lots of research has been started to try and find negative consequences of cannabis, and it's gone the other way. In fact, that I mentioned the Spanish research group. So, when you're applying to get cannabis for research, whether it's the standards or if you go through this other agency called NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the US, where you can actually get joints, or Monsanto stuff, you've got to explain what you're using it for. So there's been research that's been put together, abstracts have been done, cannabis has been supplied, but all to find a negative consequence. And I believe that the Spanish were trying to find a lethal dose, and putting it right into the brains of someone was going to produce a lethal dose, but they did see that interaction with the tumours, and that's how that came about. So, yeah.
Also, on the ABC, on the Australian Broadcasting Commission, I was living with my mum at Labrador and Gold Coast at the time, and they said when Paul Keating was in power, he was going to decriminalise, he was going to legalise marijuana, Paul Keating was. But then something happened, and of course got brushed under the carpet, and never heard anything more about it.
Yeah, Jeff Kennett, he got up, not only, he thought, he said the same, I've got 4 boys, 2 of my boys are using cannabis. He was the premier. He wasn't able to, Bob Carr, people using it. Frank Sartor's girlfriend at the time, Goldie, was dying of throat cancer, using medical cannabis. They couldn't get it legal, it's just not a thing. So that's the kind of stuff, when you start hearing people addressing those kinds of issues and taking it to the next level, that's when we'll know the debate's moving forward in Australia. Let's go. Thank you, everyone.
Cannabis.